My name is Charlene Margot, co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture, and we are delighted to have with us tonight author, academic advisor, and early career expert, Ana Homayoun. Take it away, Ana.
Thank you so much for having me. And Charlene, Parent Venture, Beth, you all are amazing. So I feel so grateful to be in conversation tonight around this book. Give me 1 second as I pull up the slides that I'm going to be showing for this presentation, part of it. So I wanted to start with a little bit of a background of why I wrote this book and some details to help facilitate our conversation and then our Q&A. And so the first question I always get asked is, why this book? Why now? So the real reason is I've been doing this work for over 20 years. So my office is in Los Altos. I work with schools around the world. And in the 2019, I was in 40 different cities talking about my previous book, Social Media Wellness. But what I really realized over the last few years is that it's the daily habits and the routines and the way that we're supporting students day to day with these executive functioning skills and these other pillars that I'll talk about tonight that are really fundamental to help students navigate a world where the jobs that they will likely have don't exist right now. So I actually went back to interview my former students from 15 to 20 years ago. They're now in their early 30s. And for the book, I shared their stories alongside current students and recent research to talk about the fact that our hyper focus on college admissions and all the things that go on with it, so grades and test scores and all these things, are actually missing the key fundamental pillars that really were the supportive things that were key to my former student success who are now in their early 30s. And it came about because so many of my students said to me, or their parents were contacting me, they were in their mid-20s, late 20s, some of them returned to my office to say hello. And they said, well, this is what I learned in your office, and this is what I use in my job today. And so thinking about how do we help all students gain these fundamental skills. So I talk about 4 pillars. I'm going to give you the overarching 4 pillars. The whole book is filled with practical solutions. So my whole idea around everything that I do is I know that every family is different. Every student within every family is different. I want everybody to find things that work for them in their moment so that they can meet their child where they're at. And in the Q&A, Charlene and I are going to talk about what are the ways that we can support students right now? What are the ways we can support our kids, our teens, our tweens? And I'll say that, a lot of people think with college admissions in the title, this is really for high school students. But the reality is many people have emailed me or sent me notes saying that, they're so glad that they read this now. They have a 7-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old, and it's really helped reframe the way they're thinking about supporting their children. So thinking about what are the 4 pillars. So the 4 pillars, the first one we're going to start with is systems. Then we're going to move to connection and perspective and acceptance. So when you think about that, when you think about systems, it's based on these things called executive functioning skills. And that's what I'm known for around the world and around the US in terms of my work on executive functioning skills. And to give you a sense of what executive functioning skills are, actually wasn't really a term used when I wrote my first book. That crumpled paper was due last week. So if you go back and read that book, you'll see it's not even mentioned. But it's become in the academic lexicon. And so it's good to explain. It really refers to these tasks that you have to think about and aren't automatic. So what I mean by that is organizing, planning, prioritizing, starting and completing tasks, and being adaptable when something doesn't go as planned. That's the very fundamental thing that we work on in our office at Green Ivy, and the work that we're doing with our nonprofit, Luminaria, to bring this work into schools. So when we think about this, the hyper focus on grades means that sometimes, often, kids are focused on the grades, families are focused on the grades, and they're not building that underlying workflow system that is so key for long-term success, but also is key for decreasing stress, right? So feeling organized decreases stress. And that's the key thing for parents and caregivers to remember here. So what are some things that parents can do? You know, one of the reasons that it's so important to understand this is understanding where your child is in terms of their executive functions. Maybe they're really good at organizing. Maybe they're really good at planning and prioritizing, but they struggle with starting and completing tasks. Maybe they're good, they're really strong at all of those things, but being adaptable when something doesn't go as planned is a particular challenge for them. And once all of those are looked at, it's this idea of how do we build the underlying skills under these three core functions of executive functions that I'm going to talk about in a second. So the first is this idea of inhibitory control. So when we think about inhibitory control, we often think about impulse control, or the ability to manage your impulses and think about long-term consequences versus short-term distractions. And that's usually thought of academically, like a person is able to manage distractions in order to get their work done. But what I argue in Erasing the Finish Line, one of many things that I talk about, is that inhibitory control is actually also very key for connection and building social skills, because especially when you're younger in kindergarten, first grade, second grade. So one of the schools I'm working with right now is a K-8 school. And I've been working with the K-4 teachers on routines and transitions and creating spaces of silence to support inhibitory control. So inhibitory control can also be around impulse control when something doesn't go as planned, and not blurting things out, not reacting physically in anger. And why this is so important, and I talk to school principals all the time, is they'll say, you know, I get this call from a parent that says, you know, my kid can't be in class with Johnny, they're in the 4th grade, but something happened in kindergarten. And, you know, so all of these pieces follow us in terms of connection and belonging. And the second core function around executive functioning is working memory. So are you able to remember things that you've learned previously and make connections with things that you're learning today? So a student that might struggle with working memory, you know, they might learn something in math today and then 2 days later not remember how to do it, or not be able to make connections with what they're learning right now. What we also don't realize is that there are ways that we can strengthen working memory from a very young age. So when I work with classrooms, one of the things that I do is I help them reorganize how the classroom is built, especially for elementary school, so we can help students practice their working memory skills. And the last core function is around cognitive flexibility. This to me is the most important right now as we come out of the pandemic, or we're living in a pandemic adjusted world. And the reason is cognitive flexibility is this ability to be adaptable when something doesn't go as planned. And one of the terms that I'll use later in the presentation, and I use in the book, is this idea of buoyancy. So being able to bounce back with less time and energy, even though you do process the disappointment. So I never say, don't process a disappointment that happens, or don't process the fact that it might be challenging that something's coming that requires you to be adaptable. But cognitive flexibility allows you to remove the rigidity of there's only one way to do things. Now, this is also related to college admissions, right? I want every student and every family to believe and really understand that there are multiple pathways for success, and there are multiple ways to be successful in college and beyond, and thinking that there are different ways to thrive at each step. The next is this idea of connection. And what I mean here is that families really need to think about their kids' social connections and their ability to practice face-to-face conversations. One of the things that has gotten mismatched over the last few years is the ability to start conversations and have small talk. You know, if you talk to a lot of elementary and middle school students, many of their initial conversations are around group texting, group chats, and there's a lot of potential misunderstandings, right? And so we have to actually back up and see, what are my students' strengths and places for growth when it comes to connection? Here's why that's really important. When I went back to interview my former students and they talked about middle school and high school, most of the things that they referred to and remembered, other than the things they learned around systems, is the fact that it was tied to something social, whether it was a school rally, whether it was an activity they did. And most adults feel the same way, right? When you ask them about their youth, their schooling, they'll remember something that has a social connection. It could be positive, it could be negative, it could be neutral. And yet we're not intentional about how we help students build connection. So one of the examples I give is to help students feel comfortable with small talk skills. And what I mean by that is introducing themselves to 3 to 5 new people each week if they are in a new school environment, or even, if they're at a family party, to go up to adults. Maybe they pass hors d'oeuvres or the snacks, or they help in the kitchen, but they're able to interact with others and have practice with interacting with people across generations. And here's why that's key. Because when I went back to look at my students from 15 years ago and I interviewed with them, I think this is the most important thing to remember. The ones that were the most successful by any metric you want to say, job, career, liking their career, feeling well adjusted, feeling like they had a good social network, every single one of those students was able to connect with others across differences. And that expanded their worldview. And I want to give you an example that we're in the Silicon Valley. So we're in the tech world, right? And technology in many ways, and technology companies really blew this open. So when you think about 40 years ago, 50 years ago, you might have made connections with people in your immediate world, and somebody might have made a connection to help you get a job. And that might have been really insular, right? But today, if you want to be successful at many jobs, you have to be able to communicate well with the recruiter, with the software engineer, with the business partnerships people. And I use that example of being able to connect with different people across differences as a way of thinking of how does the work that I do around erasing the finish line connect with as students are going to college and beyond, right? And so thinking about what are the ways that they can practice small talk skills. This is one great way that when students have a summer job where they're dealing with the general public. So say they're working in a grocery store or a retail store or a catering company where they have to constantly interact with others. It's giving them those small talk ability so that it doesn't seem so overwhelming. So what are the things that you can do? The first is really thinking about your child's ability to make and maintain friendships. So I talk about that. I wrote an article about that actually for the Washington Post last week, and we can send it out in the follow-up. And it was all about what are the things that you want to think about when students are trying to make and maintain friendships. And one of the key ideas is that supporting multiple non-overlapping circles of connection is really key. And what do I mean by that? So if you can, especially when students are in middle school and high school, it is very natural for friendships to change and ebb and flow, right? And so if you can help them make sure that they have multiple places where they feel a sense of belonging, maybe they have a religious youth group, maybe they have the traveling soccer team, maybe they have the tech for the musical, maybe they have something outside of school, maybe it's their cousins, maybe it's their family friends, maybe it's their job outside of school, that they have multiple different places that they feel like they connect. And the reason this is so important is this. So many of our connections have become sort of on top of one another. So the same kids we go to school with, we're on the traveling soccer team with, we also do these activities with. So if something changes in the social dynamic, it's really hard and it feels a lot worse. And it's really normal for things to change than if you had multiple places that you could plug into and you felt okay with. The next idea is this idea of perspective. And one of the things I really loved in going back and visiting with my students was learning how many of them, two things. One, many of their jobs that they really loved started out of something they liked to do in middle school or high school, right? It wasn't the same, or it wasn't exactly within it, but there was a thread, right? And so all of my goal of the work that I do in my office around building executive functioning skills is around reducing the time and energy spent on day-to-day activities so you could really pursue personal interests. And that was really key. And the second is that many of them that were thriving in jobs that didn't exist when they were in middle school and high school. So I'll give you one example. One of my students, who's not in the book, but I interviewed him and he's wonderful. He really came to me when he was actually in business school after we had worked together from 8th grade to when he went away to college. And he came back and, we had coffee when he was in business school. And he said, I really am interested in working in college athletics in some way. And that's not a normal trajectory from business school. And he said, my dream is to be an athletic director. And I said, that's awesome. How do you go about doing that? So we started to think and brainstorm, and he interviewed, sent out over 400 resumes. And he actually ended up in a first job at a university in a position in college athletics that he was the very first person to have that job. It was in data analytics. And he has since been promoted multiple times. He has switched colleges that he's worked at. He's thriving. But this idea of perspective is all about encouraging curiosity and openness to expand the narrow definition of what success looks like. And what that means is there are multiple places you can thrive. And the focus on college admissions has really created this narrow definition of success. One of the interviews I did recently asked me why. Why is it right now that we have such a hyper focus on college admissions? And why does it feel like over-determined in some way? And so I want to take you back on this idea of perspective to think about 2007 and 2008, for those of you who remember that time. There are a couple key things that happened back to back. One, we had the economic downturn, right? And so that created this economic pessimism, right? People are very worried that their children will not be able to get a job, and being able to go to a certain type of school, a certain name of school made all the difference. The research actually supports that it's the experiential programs, it's the way kids engage when they're in college that make all the difference. And that's what I found in my research in going back and visiting my students. And then the other piece of this is that the iPhone came out. And when the iPhone came out and all the apps came out, the other thing that happened is that many colleges ramped up their marketing efforts. So before, when I was applying to college in the 90s, I would get a bunch of stuff in the mail, but that was about it. But now, if you look at any student that gets email that accidentally signed up for something related to college admissions, they're getting 50 to 100, hundreds of emails. So a lot of adults wonder why kids do not respond to emails, or all the emails fall through the cracks. They are getting bombarded with spam. So side note, what I always recommend is students create a college-only email that they give out just to colleges or things that related to colleges. So all the college-related emails go to one thing, especially if they're at school right now and they're getting emails from their teachers and all of those things. But the thing to think about here is, how can you expand as parents and caregivers the definition of what success looks like, so that we're focusing on those fundamental underlying systems-based skills like organizing, planning, prioritizing, starting and completing tasks, and adaptable thinking, rather than just focusing on the grades and the test scores and then ultimately college admission. So thinking about this piece of perspective, one of the things that's really important is strengthening resilience and grit. So resilience and grit are very key words. If you've been to parent education before, you've heard it a lot. And in the book, I talk about two different things. I talk about using resilience and grit, but also thinking about buoyancy, which I mentioned earlier. And buoyancy, see, the thing about resilience and grit is that it does not take into account how much time and energy it takes to bounce back. It only says you should bounce back, right? Or you should get back. But buoyancy says, how can we reduce the time and energy it takes to process a disappointment and move through it? A great example is if you have a student who, if they don't make the soccer team, or they don't get the lead in the school play, or the person they want to be in a relationship doesn't want to be in a relationship with them, seeing how much time and energy it takes them to navigate and move forward, and what are the things that you can do to help build what I call their emotional toolbox. And those are things we'll talk about later, but also I give a lot of examples in the book. And the thing that I talk about in the perspective is this underlying feeling of uncertainty. And that we have a lot of that because of the information overload. We're getting so much information coming to us at once. I talk about that in Social Media Wellness. I talk about my previous book, and thinking about all the information students are getting, or all the different communication methods, right? They could be getting 18 different texts from different people. They could be on a group chat. They could be in Instagram DMs. They're getting snaps. They're navigating TikTok. That's a lot of different pieces that can fester this uncertainty. So perspective is all about being open and curious and understanding what's important to you. And finally, it's all about acceptance. So acceptance is really key. And I think it's the trickiest for a lot of parents, to be honest. And the reason I say that is this. Acceptance is all about understanding who your child is and accepting them for who they are, in their strengths and their opportunities for growth. And where it comes in college admissions a lot is, I was just yesterday talking to a student where I said, I think the next step is maybe a different path than you thought next for college. Not that you won't get to the college or the college type of choices that you want, but just given a number of factors, here are the different pathways I think are forward. So acceptance is really accepting who your kid is in the moment. One of the things that I've found since the pandemic, more and more, is that students are not necessarily ready to go away to college at 18. That's not everybody, but those underlying fundamental skills around systems and connection are not necessarily there. And if they aren't there, like going to college and having a successful experience can be tougher. Now, it doesn't mean they'll never be there, but knowing where students are in the moment and accepting that is really key. So one of the key things I talk about in the book around acceptance is understanding your child's energy profile. So I give a lot of examples in the book, but one of the things that is really frustrating within a family is when you have multiple different children who have multiple different energy profiles, right? Or you have a parent and a caregiver and a different energy profile for the child. And here's why that's important. So if you think about it, like I'll give you an example from the book. I had a friend who went to New York, and she has a son who she would label as an orchid. And there's a book called The Orchid and the Dandelion. And so she's very extroverted, and she went with a whole plan for New York City. She was very excited. And midway through the first day, she emails me and she sends me a text, and she goes, "Oh my gosh, my child is about to have a full-on meltdown." And I said, "Oh, well, you're going. This child needs a lot of downtimes, what I call spaces of silence in the book, time to regroup. And New York is very overstimulating." And she's like, "Oh my gosh, you make such a good point." And they were staying with her aunt. And she was figuring, from 7 a.m. to, 9 p.m., we'd be out doing things, Broadway show, all the things, a Lego store, all these things. And so she revamped her thoughts, and she ended up, she said, "It was the best trip ever. He's so excited, but we spent 4 hours a day at least in my aunt's apartment playing with her dog. And that was the best thing ever for him." And so really understanding who your child is. Another example I give is this idea of taking the B. So taking the B is not about a B or not about a B minus, which is what somebody said when they looked at the slide at a previous presentation, but figuring out what is going to take the back seat in your life, whether that's an activity, whether that's a social endeavor, whether that's, something personal, as you navigate things. And then really understand, and this is what I talk about a lot in the book, is how acceptance helps us silence the culture of comparison. So I happen to grow up in the Silicon Valley, not far from, all of your community, in your community, actually. So I'm very familiar with the culture of comparison that can happen here. And really helping every student develop their own blueprint is key. But the first step is thinking about this idea of acceptance and the other three pillars along with it. So all of these four, I hope this gives you a good overview of the book, how systems and connection and perspective and acceptance really will help us help every child develop their own blueprint. So I am going to invite Charlene back, and I'll stop sharing. And so we're going to have a little bit of a conversation, which I'm really excited about because Charlene and I are friends. We actually share the same birthday, among other things. So it's very fun to be in conversation with Charlene.
Ana was actually one of our very first speakers. Ana, what year did That Crumpled Paper Was Due Last Week come out?
Oh, goodness. It came out in 2010. Yes, you were also generous to have me. And I would just started learning how to speak in front of audiences.
That's right. And it was back in the Menlo Atherton Library before we even moved into the Performing Arts Center. So we do go way back.
We do go way back.
Ana, you've written on really divergent topics when it comes to our youth. You've written about organization, and That Crumpled Paper Was Due Last Week. You've written about perfectionism and the myth of the perfect girl. You've written about technology and social media wellness. What brought you to write this book, this topic?
This book was really a culmination of over 20 years of work with students. That this idea was, I was hearing from all my former students that they were thriving, and they were saying consistently, these are the things that I learned in your office, that I'm using in my life, that I'm using in my workplace. This is how I navigated a job switch, all of these pieces. And yet every year I would also see these hyper stressed out families, because we do a lot of college advising in our office. And parents would be so stressed out. Students would be so stressed out around the college admissions process. And the thing is that now I have this like runway of these students that I remember where they were sophomore year, junior year, senior year, and they're thriving. These are students, some of them, as I say in the beginning of the book, they were not straight A students. They came from different backgrounds. Some had more resources than others. But there were some really consistent underlying daily habits, routines, and skills that were fundamental regardless of their background. And I wanted to write this book to really reduce the anxiety and overwhelm that families are feeling right now.
So Ana, if you would tell us a little bit more about why you see these organizational, foundational, executive functioning skills as being so critical for kids. Young ones, old ones, college ones.
Yeah, this is such a great question. So remember that when I started doing this work in 2001, there was no Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, TikTok, Snapchat, all the things. There was no learning management system that you could track your children's homework and they're missing homework. And so when the iPhone first came out, I noticed that distractions were changing. And why I say this is we've always had this piece, and I've had this argument for years, that middle school, what we ask of students in terms of their brain development, in terms of juggling multiple things, where they are in terms of brain development may not match up, which is why so many kids in middle school feel like this lack of confidence in their ability to get things done. And it's very hard for them to juggle. Now, add on technology. This is why my job is so interesting, is that we now had technology. And so I wrote Social Media Wellness in 2017, and then the pandemic happened. And so we took technology and learning in the classroom, and we just sort of like went on the high-speed highway, but we never provided coaching around how to manage technology. And because teachers often didn't get training around this. Like one of the school districts I worked with in the South, one of the things I was finding is that the teachers didn't know how to navigate Canvas. Well, so the teachers come to me, we're doing a webinar around certain things around executive functioning, and they're bringing up these questions. And I was like, wait, do you know how to navigate Canvas? This is a technology question, not an executive functioning question. And they said, oh, there was one presentation on it but I missed it. And I'm not blaming teachers here. There's no blame here. The focus is that we've all been given so much technology at once, and we've never really stepped back to have that ongoing coaching around how do you now navigate a world where you start and complete tasks, where you manage distractions, where you are adaptable when you have all this information coming at you.
So, Ana, you said, I remember this clearly from your very first talk. When kids first came to you, they were bringing in their backpacks and they were disorganized and they were filled full of junk, and you would help them sort that out. But now, as you say, with technology, I don't think kids get trained in how to create files on their desktop and how to, really just organize their tech. Is that something that you do as well? And is that something that you think parents should be supporting kids with?
Oh, absolutely. So that is one of the main things that we do. So when people read that crumpled paper was due last week, I remind them that it came out in 2010. So when kids come into our office, that is a key part of our initial work with them. But the other thing that, I think is important to mention is in the last 6 years, we developed a nonprofit initiative, because my goal, my life's work, is to bring this to all schools, to all kids, so that every child has access to the work. I think, the reason I wrote Erasing the Finish Line is also to give those key skills to families and caregivers and educators and policymakers around what I have seen be so fundamental. And then also, how do we bring this into schools? Because it is not the fault of schools that we don't have this. It is simply a new way that we can prevent a lot of the overwhelm, right? That idea that being organized decreases stress, having a system in place makes you feel on top of things and makes you feel a sense of autonomy and competence. So what are the things that we can do to bring this in the mainstream?
Okay, fair enough. And I remember we did these workshops during the pandemic where you were trying to teach people about, you've got to have some place for kids to study. It can be in the corner, it can be the kitchen table, but it just has to be a place, right? So we kind of keep evolving in terms of what's needed. So we're going to shift gears. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we're going to turn to the audience questions a little early because we have so many great questions coming in. So here we go. Ana, you talk about in the book that you are a child of immigrants, and that made your perception, peer relationships, adult relationships different. And then you moved to California. So how did your family's background and upbringing influence the way you built skills around connection and perspective?
I love this question. I really haven't gotten that a lot. So yeah, as I talk about in the book, I grew up in rural Connecticut till I was 12, and then my family moved to the Silicon Valley. And so that was the biggest culture shock of my life. But in many ways, I moved from a lower opportunity space, wasn't completely low, but like to this new gigantic place with so much opportunity and just a different language and a different culture. And it was completely different. The other thing for me is both of my parents worked, and they didn't have any family close by, or they didn't have a deep network because we had moved. And so navigating the social piece of school was always a little bit of a challenge. One of the things I think that created for me was this opportunity to do something that I call in the book floating. And I actually think this is really key for all kids. And when I went back to interview my students, the ones that went to school with the same kids K through 12, that was really great for a lot of reasons, because it gave stability, especially if their social connections were strong, right? If they weren't, that's a different story. But once they went to college, if they weren't in a place where they had learned a lot of, you had to introduce themselves to a lot of new people, like I had to in middle school and high school, it was actually much more challenging for them. That's one of the things I found that was interesting. And this idea, that's why I give the idea of connecting across differences and having practice to do so. So it changed the way I connect in terms of the fact that I had to, my sister and I are really outgoing, but also inclusive people, because we know what it's like to not always feel included. We know what it's like to look at life from two different perspectives. We know what it's like to have to be our family's translator, whether that's literal translation, or just the family spokesperson, and you take care of the forms and all of those things. And it gave me a greater empathy for, all of the sacrifices that families make to try and make sure that their kids have the best possible options. And that's true regardless of your background, right? Like that's one of the things that I feel like is the biggest gift that I got is, kids often say to me, families, is that my approach is very non-judgmental. Like nothing is going to surprise me, scare me, make me feel, because we're all doing our very best. And being able to be so cognizant of so many different backgrounds and feel really comfortable with that has been the greatest gift, I think, in my work.
Well, thank you, Ana. I feel that, and I feel that in your staff. You have such wonderful counselors at Green Ivy Educational Consulting. Okay, we're going to turn it to questions from the audience because we have so many good questions coming in. But let's start with defining a term. Ana, what is the finish line, and why is it being erased?
So erasing the finish line is the whole concept that college for so many families is this finish line that's faulty, that's been created. It's this faulty finish line, right? So even like you hear about like 8-year-olds, or I get emails from like parents of 7th graders, or like, what does my child need to do to get to college? And it's almost as if 18 years of child rearing, the grade is where your child is going to school and where they get in. And my whole thing is that's not the finish line, right? That isn't the grading. And there shouldn't be a finish line because everyone is growing and evolving. Like one of the great things about the book is that 2 of the students transferred schools, colleges. Now they didn't transfer schools because they were upset or they had a bad experience, actually, and that would have been fine too. They transferred because they evolved, and the school that they were at didn't meet their evolving needs as a growing adult. And in both cases, specifically one with Henry, that's the name I've given him. Henry was in my first book, and I would go back to visit him in Erasing the Finish Line. And Henry, because he developed systems in a way that he built his confidence, he went from a 2.7 to a 3.8 by the time he was at the end of high school. He then thought things were possible that he would have never, thought, because it built his confidence. So then he started to take really healthy risks. And one of them was transferring schools to go into a program that was meaningful to him.
All right, that makes sense. Okay, Ana, here we go. You talked about social circles. So here's a good question. Would non-overlapping circles prevent you from deeper, more intimate connections? I wonder if the idea of having many different circles is perhaps more recent or privileged phenomenon in our busy lives.
That's a great question. So a couple things. So one of the things that I talk about is how to have non-transactional and genuine connections and moving beyond the transactional phase. So it's not about having not deep connections. The reality, though, the data is pretty crazy, right? So we have fewer close friends than ever before. And this is true for adults. So one of the things I give as an example is for parents and caregivers to look at their own friendships and navigating that. The other thing to think about is we actually naturally had non-overlapping friendship circles or, connections. And more often when social media and technology didn't exist. And so we just didn't really realize it. So you might go see your cousins and you might see family friends, or you might have friends outside of school. Like my family, we might interact with other families from our similar background, but they wouldn't go to the same school as me. So there were naturally non-overlapping circles of connection. And you don't need to have a ton of them. But my whole point is when all of your friends are in one central hub that's overlapping and something happens in the friendship dynamic, it is the number one thing that keeps families, parents, caregivers up at night is the social dynamic. I just got a call yesterday from a parent who felt that way. So this is more of a preventative. And I don't feel like it's an act of privilege. When I was in high school, I worked retail and I worked with people who didn't go to my high school. That was one community. It doesn't have to be close, necessary friends, but one of the things I talk about in the book is this idea of stronger ties and weaker ties and developing both, because a lot of times you'll find that the weaker ties are really helpful when you need to like get a job or, like, and sometimes stronger ties won't be as helpful. It's a good thing to think about.
Well, and as my co-founder, Bev Hartman, says, sometimes you need to find friendlier friends.
I love that Bev says that. And I talked about that in the Washington Post article, the idea that we kind of don't tell or help students understand that if your friends are keeping you up at night because you're so nervous or upset or frustrated, then that's probably not a great place to feel a sense of belonging.
Exactly. All right, Ana, we're getting some questions around your 4 pillars. If you would, can you give us a very brief recap of the 4 pillars?
Sure. So systems are based on executive functioning skills, which I talk about in detail in the book. And a lot of people have come back and say, I really learned a lot around that. So systems. And then the next is around connection. So building non-transactional friendships and connections. But also I talk in the book about making sure every child has supporters, so supportive peers, and clarifiers. So those are trusted adults, people that you trust, that can provide guidance and clarity. And those can be either mentors, so people that provide mentorship, and sponsors are this term that I use to describe people that can make an economic impact on your child's life. So help them find a job, help them learn about new programs that can really move their lives forward. Perspective is all around expanding the definitions of what's possible. And one of the things we find, no matter what background you're from, is that there's a very narrow definition of what success looks like, regardless of your community. And this goes back to when I was visiting 40 different cities in 2019. I was like, goodness, I am going to all these communities and they all have a slightly different narrow definition of what success looks like, but they have one. And so this idea of building openness and curiosity and having exposure and shared experiences. And the last is around acceptance. So accepting who your child is, what their strengths are, what their opportunities for growth. Somebody pointed out one of my stories in the book is the student Joseph. And Joseph was one of those students that wasn't ready to go away to school, to a 4-year university, but did. And I had given the family the warning that I didn't think the child was ready. They did not listen. And then he comes back and he was, withdrew and from college, but then he ended up going to school locally, got a job, built a community, is thriving as a marketing executive 10 years later at a billion-dollar technology company because he had the connection skills, the system skills he had outside of the classroom. And with students like that who are really great at connecting, great emotional intelligence, but like sitting in a classroom for 6 hours is so challenging. I always say we want to help them build systems to get them through without killing and crushing their spirit.
Yeah, such a good point, Ana. Here's a great question. If you could solve this one, I think I don't know what. This is every parent. What do you have to say about parenting a teenager who is fiercely independent and refuses any involvement or help navigating school?
So part of the thing to think about is the why, right? Why are they not? And if it's working and they're doing fine, then and I think that's part of the acceptance. Are they doing fine, right? Are they doing well? And if that's the case, then that's one piece. If they're not, and there are pieces that are concerning, and again, everyone's definition of not doing fine is different. So I don't know where that is. But if they're not, making sure that they have trusted adults that they feel a sense of connection with is the first step. And so that's one of the things, Charlene, you and I have talked about this before, that your relationship with your child is not worth the missing homework or the low test grade or all those other things. Making sure they have a trusted adult, whether that is a family friend, whether that is a cousin, whether, that's why people call our office, but making sure they have somebody that you trust that can provide, that they feel a connection to is important. And so a lot of times students are independent. This actually brings up a really important point though, too, from Erasing the Finish Line. When I went back to visit the students, and one of the stories I tell is around economic mobility. Mm-hmm. The key thing that I found is that for students that were from lower resourced areas, right? They may have grown up poor and they were really trying to thrive. Their ability to ask for help or know that they could ask for help was actually much more challenging.
Mhm.
Kids from affluent areas knew when they went to college to sign up for tutoring, free tutoring that first day. Oftentimes kids from lower resource backgrounds would wait until they were struggling in the class. And one of the key pieces I found, and one of the things we talk about in my the nonprofit advisory curriculum, one of the lessons is knowing when to ask for help,
Yeah.
because we believe that that's a really key piece of supporting student success.
And not always natural for a child who is more introverted or shy to do.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And that's where small talk skills come into play, and practicing that. Just because a child is introverted doesn't mean that they can't figure out the multiple pathways they can ask for help, especially now that things are online, and not feeling like it is a weakness to figure out what are the support systems I need to thrive.
That's right. My son used to go and visit the counselors at his high school and just chat because he liked them. But I know
Yeah.
that's not typical. That's not typical. All right, Ana, here's a question that I think is a good one for you because you have many of these students in your office. Parent asks, I'd love to know more about managing executive function in ADHD students, especially how to see ADHD as a productivity strength rather than a weakness.
Oh, I love this question. And for those of you who don't know, I have an entire chapter on neurodiversity in the book, specifically because, and Henry's story. So Henry was diagnosed with ADHD before he came into my office. So there's two things that I often speak about with students with neurodiversity. One is this idea of acceptance, accepting who you are and what your strengths are, and also what are the time, structure, and support that you need to thrive. So one of the great things about Henry, he is now 32, he owns a condo, he has a great job, all of these things. And when he started in my office as a sophomore, he had a 2.8 GPA, and his school counselor was saying college was not necessarily an option. But we focus on the habits and the routines and thinking about building structures that worked for him. So around organizing, planning, prioritizing. But he also came in weekly. So we had that weekly structure and support. Part of this idea of acceptance, specifically for students with ADHD, is knowing that there's not a like, do 5 sessions and this is solved. This is a life journey of what are the touch points that you need to thrive. And so even today, he talks about this as like, he's one of the people that says, I do this every day in my job that I learned from you, because those are my touch points to getting things done. So managing distractions, working in 25 to 45-minute blocks, figuring out what are the exercise routines, like what times does he get up and move around so that he's constantly focused when he's sitting back down. He has different things. So like he has a high chair or like a semi-high chair. That's all actually pretty common. So sitting up also at a desk is really helpful for him. The second piece around this, though, and this is one of the key things in the book that I go in detail that's very different from how other people talk about this, is specifically for students with ADHD, one of the things we really need to think about is energy management rather than time management. So what I mean by that is back to this idea of productivity. You are very productive in periods of ADHD when you are hyper-focused. And so much so that you can work for 5 hours at a time, you can get things done. Peter Shankman is someone very famous. He's written books about having ADHD. And when he writes his books, he has done this before, where he takes a business class trip to Asia, and then he turns around, and we can't all do that. But that's where he hyper-focuses. So what I help students think about is, how do they manage their energy so they don't get to that point where even picking up a towel off the floor seems like a really big boulder?
Mhm.
And how do they back up when they get to that place and come from a place of acceptance rather than that shame spiral and that paralysis that often happens?
Yeah.
Because what happens a lot of times is they're like feeling so ashamed that they didn't get this assignment in, that they then go into a paralysis shame spiral and nothing gets done. And then everybody's like, well, where are you? What are you doing? Back to that acceptance. Okay, I'm right here. These are the things that are my touch points to help get me back on track, to help manage my energy.
Okay, thank you, Ana. Good points. Here's a related question. Parent asks, can you talk for a minute about helping kids bounce back after disappointments?
Yes. So here are the things that I think about when we talk about bouncing back after disappointment. We often say you should just, be resilient and get back up. That's not really fair. I think, just like a 2-year-old has a tantrum and then they move through to the other side, you really need to be able to have the skills to process, but move through, hopefully without a physical tantrum or something that affects, long-term consequences for you as a middle school, high school, or college student. But the things that we can put in place preventatively are two things. One, the emotional toolbox. So I talk a lot about that in the book, but really briefly, what are the things that students can do offline, that whether that's drawing, whether that's playing with a pet, whether that's going outside, having them collaboratively identify that 3 to 5 things ahead of time, and ideally offline. Because a lot of what times when somebody is online on a phone, a lot of kids will say, well, I just want to watch Netflix. And anytime you go online, there's that multiple opportunities for things to be bombarding you. And let me give an example, since this book, people have said it's about college admissions. When you don't get it, when you get deferred, early action, or early decision, you apply and in December you don't get in, or you get deferred. Going online to bombard yourself with other people's acceptance videos, which I hope stops this year, is not energizing. But thinking about identifying what are the 5 ways that you can support yourself, whether that's taking a bath, talking to a friend, going, doing something outdoors. What are the things that can get you out of the space? And then also, what are the things that can sort of break the habit for you? And the second piece is, how do you preventatively make sure that your children have both supporters, so peers that are supportive, but also trusted adults that you trust? Because they may not come to you, but that they have trusted adults that you feel like they can reach out to is really key, especially in these moments where there's a lot of stress. And I think that is particularly important in this time, and I'll tell you why. So one of the things I talk about in the book is when I went to do the tour for social media wellness, I always gave a survey ahead of time at every school across the country. And at every school, I don't care if it was public, private, affluent, less resourced, it did not matter. 8 to 10% of students said that they did not have a peer or trusted adult they could go to if something didn't happen, if something didn't go as planned. And to me, that's a wake-up call. So if there's one thing you get from this or thinking about this is identifying, do my children have these pieces in place preventatively right now?
Okay. Anna, let's see if we can quickly get to 2 more, all right, before we close. This is a really good question. Parent says, I've heard that the prefrontal cortex really doesn't mature until kids are in their mid-20s. We know that. Aren't we really expecting too much of kids to pick a college major or a career when they're 17, 18, or 20? How can we help? I agree.
Well, I agree with this. So that's where perspective comes in. So if we're looking at this as an opportunity to always be open and curious, and we're also building those system skills in middle school and high school so kids have time to explore, then we're looking at it as there's not a finish line with your major. We're looking at it that there is not a finish line when you go to 18. There are very few schools. There are schools, though, that you have to declare your major. One of the great things about the US college system, and there's a lot of challenges, but one of the great things is you don't have to declare your major, and it's fairly easy to change it. I work with a lot of kids in the UK and through other systems, and you have to declare, and it's a 3-year system, and a lot of 3 years, and it's very highly specialized. 75%, something like 75% of students change their major. What is helpful, though, underlying is this openness and curiosity to explore, to know that there's not just one pathway. So even if you do major in something, that it is of interest, but that you also build these underlying 4 pillars that are helping you be adaptable no matter what happens.
Really true. I remember when my daughter was a college senior at a local university here, colors are red and white, you may know, she was certain that everybody but her knew what their career was going to be. And I kept saying, they don't. Now at 32, she believes me, but back then it was a really tough sell.
Well, and I think this is a really important point that I talk about in perspective and acceptance pillars, is that a lot of times students and families grab onto this certainty because uncertainty is so uncomfortable. So if I'm certain I want to go to this college, or I'm certain that I want to be this major or this career choice, it sort of like takes away some of that stress that comes from, hey, I don't know. And what that does, though, in the long run is if you're not open and curious, like I always say, there's multiple ways to have any sort of career. And the characteristics of a job is what we should be thinking about, because that, again, opens up different opportunities and pathways.
Yeah. So we're going to close with this question, because I just think this is a great question. Parent asks, do you ever ask your students what they would have wanted their parents to do more of or less of?
I think, no, I don't really, but one of the things I do hear, if this helps, is that a lot of kids will say, I wish they would stress less, because they can feel the stress that parents feel and caregivers feel, and we all feel that stress right now. So I think that that is one of the things that, and just have fun, like figure out what can we do this weekend that's just like, isn't checking a box, but just enjoying ourselves.
Well, thank you, Ana. I think that is a wonderful place to end. I just want to really appreciate all of you who asked such wonderful questions, and Ana Homayoun for writing really a wonderful book that's a guidebook for parents. But more than that, it gives us a sense of that, we got this. We got this, kids and parents, we can do this. But Ana, your advice is so timely and so helpful. So thank you again for you and for writing a wonderful book. Take care, everybody, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you for joining us tonight. And special thanks to my friend and birthday mate, Ana Homayoun. Take care, everybody. Hope to see you soon.